All right. Hello, beautiful students. This is a review of Book 1, Part 9. When we left last time on this document, I was introducing the Lotus Eaters and pointed out to you that before they actually went to the land of the Lotus Eaters, he was on the island of the Sycanies and he lost a lot of men there. But notice, that when they were there, they were robbing and killing them because they were allies with the Trojans. And therefore, Odysseus found it completely okay to do what he was doing, but obviously he paid the price. And again, notice, right, delayed by a storm for 2 days. And who's in charge of the weather? Zeus, but storms usually on the ocean are caused by Poseidon. So keep this all in mind. So now when he went to the Lotus Eaters, we learn about a group of people that weren't very dangerous per se, but what they did is they offered this sweet lotus that we learned that they live upon this. And those who ate the honey plant never cared to report nor to return. And a lot of people equate this to the effect of drugs and specifically opiates that come from the opium flower, drugs such as heroin, Oxycontin, and this is kind of an ancient version of it. And it's this idea that the people didn't necessarily want to harm anyone, but they were very addicted to the flower or the drug that they took. But when Odysseus figured out that his men basically fell in line with these type of people, notice what he does, right? Here he says, I drove them all three wailing to the ships, tied them down under their rowing benches, and called to the rest, all hands aboard, come, clear the beach, and no one taste the lotus, or you lose your hope of home. And so notice here the heroic leadership that he takes on. He assesses the situation of the Lotus Eaters. He realizes the effect that it has on his men, and in a quick decision makes for the ship with his men and warns every single other person to clear the beach and not taste the lotus, because then they will all have the same reaction. Another part of this heroic quote here is if you look at how he says, I drove them like cattle, right? All three wailing to the ships. Now, these are Greek warriors, 3 large Greek warriors who are obviously skilled both physically and in battle mentally. And the fact that he is able to drive 3 grown basic linebackers back to the ship, he's able to tie them down in a manner that allows him to actually take charge as the captain of the crew, really, really does show not only his physicality, his physical prowess as a hero, but also his leadership in that moment. And they move on to the next land where they found the Cyclops. Now, again, just to remind you, we're going in order here, but what Odysseus has done is now that he's with King Alcinous, he's flashing back to the beginning of all his trials. So even though before he goes to Alcinous, he's with Calypso, he's going back before he ended up on Calypso's island, right? So you start off with the few stories so far, right? The first one, we're told in the beginning here, is basically the land of the Sycanies, okay? Sorry. So he deals with the Sycanies, then he runs into the Lotus Eaters, and now He's on his adventure with the Cyclops. So notice that all of this is the rising action, and it is Odysseus's adventures, making it home from Troy. Beautiful. So he does have the ability to kind of comment on the things that he's already gone through. And it is Odysseus's perspective. So again, keep in mind that he is narrating or orating this entire story to King Alcinous. Okay? Now he introduces the Cyclops, right? And this entire adventure really does, again, highlight his heroic behavior, and then also some not so heroic behavior. All right, we get some description of the Cyclops here. A prodigious man. Okay, this is one of your vocab words, which means someone who's very very overbearing and very big, very intimidating. Okay. But when they beached there, right, he told his crew to stand by and keep watch over the ship. If you recall in the previous story with the Lotus Eaters, you know, he sent one picked man and 2 runners. But now he decides that he's going to go. He took his 12 best fighters. So whether or not this is a leadership quote, it's up to you and how you analyze it. Right? But he also had the forethought here to bring sweet liquor with him. And he goes on to describe the effect of this liquor. And he talks about not a slave in Marin's household knew this drink. That's how very good it was. It was only saved for special guests. Ruby colored, honey smooth. And you could take 1 cupful of this liqueur and put it in 20 more cups of water, and that's how it was normally served. But keep in mind that he's bringing some of what he has to offer to the Cyclops, but there's a reason why he's bringing wine, right? He got a wineskin full, right? Victuals in a bag, which is food, right? Because notice here, in his bones, he says he knew something was going to happen. So he has kind of a premonition that what he's getting into is not necessarily positive. And whether or not you think that is leadership is something that you can argue on your hero worksheet. Okay? But after they noticed the Cyclops had gone, they went ahead and they took from his cave cheeses, a bunch of different things that he had. And the men are like, let's go, right? They're pleading. Why not take the cheeses, get them stowed, come back, throw open the pens and make a run for it, right? Steal his cattle, and then we'll get back out to sea. But notice Odysseus here, right? How sound that was. In reflection, he realizes that was a better idea. But he says he refused because he wished to see the caveman. So it's almost like his curiosity really hindered his best judgment here, right? So is curiosity something a leader should have or not, right? In this case, his curiosity gave him no pretty sight, especially for his friends. Now, you know exactly what happens here, right? We are introduced to the Cyclops. He is a very, very brute person. He does not respect the gods, right? He even says here, like, we care not a whistle for your thundering Zeus, right? And that's really insulting, right? And to Odysseus and any Greek man, that would definitely be a large red flag that the gentleman is not going to be able to be reasoned with, right? But now when he's talking with the Cyclops, Odysseus notices that he's not going to be hospitable. He's not going to welcome them. And when he asks, where's your ship? Odysseus thinks quickly, right? Saying that they were all shipwrecked, when we know that he's left his whole crew behind. So again, in the moment, right, he's able to use his guile or his ability, excuse me, to trick the Cyclops, right? But It didn't matter, because what happens, a cyclop starts snacking on his friends like squirming puppies, right? Ew, very gross imagery, but definitely an example of the poetic style here. A lot of imagery. And specifically here, we see a simile. So you can really picture what the Cyclops does to Odysseus's poor men. And notice how Odysseus, like we do, cry to God, asking why something so awful is happening. In the heat of the moment, Odysseus really gets upset and he wants to stab the Cyclops. But notice, right when he was about to stab him, he stops. So here you can argue that yes, he's a leader, because even when he's affected to the point of retaliating, he stops and quickly changes his behavior to benefit not only himself, but his men in this situation. And he, in that moment, was able to save as many men as he could, versus maybe only one or two. So they stay in the Cyclops' cave, and when the Cyclops leaves, notice how Odysseus again uses his wit, right? He's in the middle of a major tragedy here. He's losing men left and right, but he's got to keep his cool and use his brain. And notice how he gives props to Athena, right? The goddess of wisdom here to help him. And he comes up with a plan. Now, in this plan, we see a nice example of an epic simile when they talk about the actual tree trunk that he chose to use for his weapon. He sharpens it as well as he can in order to make sure that the weapon can be used in his plan. Now, when it comes to actually choose the people to work with him, he actually gives a roll of the dice, but he's already volunteered. Okay, so he gives his men a choice, but he actually decides that he's going to lead this attack, right? So again, right, we get some example here of a leader. And notice how he comes up with the idea of using that wine, and he didn't water it down, right? And he gave him 3 full bowls. So we're talking, no matter how prodigious or large the Cyclops Polyphemus is, or Polyphemus, depending on how you want to pronounce his name, he's definitely going to be affected by the amount of alcohol in his system. And while he's doing this, he tells the Cyclops that his name is Nobody. And he probably didn't pronounce it just like that, but it was probably more like not buddy. And so when he would yell, it would come out, as nobody. But notice the forethought here, right? His plan that he's putting into action has several steps. And he keeps his cool. He's calm, right? And he's able to act in a situation when it's needed. And when he actually, the Cyclops actually does pass out, right? He goes over his plan or his execution of the plan. Now he's driving that big spike or that big weapon that they've made in the embers, right? He's cheering his men with battle talk, right? So he's definitely encouraging them, right? He uses his physicality again, right? Let's see. He lugged it near the Cyclops with his men, right? Let's see. And as more than natural force nerve them, right? So they've got some divine intervention here, or at least you feel it. Straightforward, they sprint, lifted it, and obviously blinded the Cyclops. Now here what I've done is I've highlighted for you an example of an epic simile. And what they do here is Odysseus describes what they did with the weapon. He says, I leaned on it, turning it as, right? You could use the word like there if you'd like to. A shipwright turns a drill in planking, having men below to swing the two-saddled strap that spins it into the groove. This is actually a term that's used in nautical fields with ancient mariners. You can look it up if you want to see exactly how he did it, but he was explaining it to King Alcinous, who would know nautical terms. And he also uses here, so with our brand we bored the great eye socket while blood ran around the red hot bar. And then we have some imagery to really show that poetic style of Homer that really disgustingly describes what happens to the eye. He even goes again into another epic simile about how gross and just horrific the actual pain was, right? And now we get a little bit more of Odysseus's leadership or skills when he says that nobody, or Polyphemus rages to the other gods and to the other Cyclops around him that nobody has tricked him. And obviously the Cyclops, well, then obviously pray to Poseidon if nobody's tricked you. And notice here, Odysseus laughs. I mean, I know that Polyphemus ate at least 6 of his guys, but I mean, the fact that you're laughing at the fact that someone's being harmed, I don't know, is that heroic? That's totally up to you. But he was really happy with his plan, or at least that's the feeling that you get. But notice, he kept thinking about how are we going to get out of here, right? He had to run through tactics, right? Reasoning, and then a trick came to him, right? And he comes up with it in the heat of the moment. Now, you could argue that this is leadership because he definitely uses his intellectual skills here. But why didn't he have this plan ahead of time, right? Is that really showing leadership if you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants? And that's up to you. But he came up with this idea of tying together all of the Cyclops' rams that were really fat, and the men would hold on under each one of them to ride there safely, okay? Only kind of tied them up there, right? But breathing hard, they waited until morning in order to get out. And then when morning does come and the Cyclops lets out his flock, Odysseus and his men are able to get away. And then notice how quickly he moves here. As soon as they get out, you got to remember that they've just had a very rough time with this guy. It's been about 24 hours, 24 or 48, and he's quickly moving, getting his men together. Not only that, but also gets the food that's running around and loads them up onto his boats. And he's telling his men, right, be quick about it. But after all of this, right, he could just sail away and the Cyclops would not know anything. But then he actually goes ahead and he taunts the Cyclops, right? And notice, right, when he's upset, right, he rips off a hilltop and heaves it after the men. And it almost pushes them all the way back to the shore. So because of this, Odysseus again has to exert his physical leadership and using his leadership to tell his men to put their backs into it so they can get away. And the men protest, right, which is borderline mutiny. Right? You don't go against your captain on a boat, right? Why bait him again? Let him alone. And he says, basically, Odysseus says, I would not heed them in my glorying spirit. So here we see this hubris, right? B-R-I-S. This overconfidence that many heroes tend to have, right? Again, he could have sailed away after that. But no, what does he do? He tells him, using an epithet, right? Odysseus, raider of cities, took your eye. Laertes' son, whose home is on Ithaca. He basically gave him GPS to where he actually lives. Amazing. So Is that leadership as you would define it? That's up to you. But basically here, because he has given him his name, Polyphemus prays to his father Poseidon, right? Basically saying, please do not let him ever return home. And if he does, make sure he has no men. And when he gets there, there's going to be bitter days. So really kind of setting up everything for the return in part 2. But let's see here. We'll see. I just wanted to point this out before I finish this recording. Here again, we see reverence to the gods that he shows to Zeus. But Zeus at this point has disdained his offerings and messes with the men all the way back home from that point on. So Odysseus, because of his hubris and his ability to really tick off the gods, ended up pushing it a little too far, and a little bit of foreshadowing for what's to come. And that's it.